Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Closing the Productivity Gap, How to Unlock Employee Productivity Through Better Data. If you don't know Ciphr, we're a leading UK developer of HR, recruitment and learning software that helps organisations to attract, engage and retain their workforces more effectively. We're proud to have HFX on board as one of our Ciphr Connect partners. Their workforce management software connects seamlessly with Ciphr, offering a brilliant user experience and reducing the admin burden of setting up individual users in both systems. I'm Cathryn Newbery and I'm Ciphr's Content Marketing Editor. I'm joined today by Nick Whiteley, HFX's CEO. Welcome, Nick. It's great to have you with us today.
Hi there. Hello, everyone.
Okay, first up, a little housekeeping. The webinar should last around 45 minutes with around 30 minutes from us and then time at the end to answer your questions. Do send in your questions, comments and queries using the box on screen at any time during the broadcast and we'll do our best to answer them as quickly as we can. If you miss anything or have to leave the broadcast at any time, not to worry. Everyone who is registered will receive a link shortly after this broadcast ends to an on-demand version you can watch at any time or share with your colleagues if you think they'll be interested. Just on to a quick overview of our agenda. We're going to look at the UK's productivity puzzle and its causes, 5 areas that you need to focus on to close the productivity gap, 5 questions you need to answer to tackle productivity, and 3 solutions that help measure and drive productivity, and then into your question and answer at the end. Just to kick us off, we're going to ask you to take part in our first poll. To what extent is productivity a problem for your organisation? You should see this poll with some options on your screen now, so choose the one that's most relevant to you. Is it not an option? You're doing okay? It's an area you need to focus on. It's a significant issue for you, or you don't know. Nick, what do you expect would be the most common option there selected by our audience?
I think that in my view, probably the most common one is that it's an area we need to focus on, because I think that for many organisations that they might be aware there's an issue, but they don't know how significant that issue is.
Okay, thanks, Nick. That's great and ties really nicely with the results that I've seen come through. So 60% of our audience say that it is an area we need to focus on. So that's fantastic because you're in the right place. We're talking about productivity today. Worryingly, 20% of you say you don't know how much of a problem this is for you. Again, great to have you with us. You're in the right place because we're going to be looking at some of the measures that can help you understand that challenge a little bit better. Okay, we're going to dive into our presentation now, and I'm just going to hand over to Nick.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'm going to dive straight by talking about the problem of productivity. In the UK, we measure that GDP per hour worked. If you look at the graph, which shows the productivity not just of the UK but against comparative economic blocks like the Economic Union, OECD, G7, etc. What's not surprising is that if you look at 2008, when we had the crash, productivity took a major hit. The big surprise is, though, that all the other comparative blocks actually made that recovery back on trend over the subsequent years. However, the UK has bucked the trend and is still lagging behind, has been lagging behind since 2009. If we go to the next slide, we can focus solely onto the UK. Here you can see just how significant the problem is. So you've got since 1994 onwards. You can see in the dotted lines the trend that if nothing had changed, where we should be as of 2008. And you can see the significant gap where effectively for the last decade, the UK has been flatlining effectively on productivity, so-called the lost decade, 20% less productivity than we should have this year. If we move on to the next slide, we can see a comparison between previous recessions and how the UK has done. So we're trying to understand why we're different from other similar economies recovering from a recession, where we have so far completely failed to get back in terms of productivity. We look back into previous recessions just within the UK, and we can see that in every other recession, within a 2-year window, we've bounced back into the trend. So this time it's very, very different from previous recessions as well as from other comparable economies. So this is the problem that we're dealing with, a flatlining of productivity throughout the UK for many years now. So we'll look at what that means for organisations like yourself on the next slide. So the impact of poor productivity within an organisation, yes, it's obviously loss of competitiveness and contracts, but that translates into reduced profits, reduced growth. Poor productivity means that you actually can't afford to give staff increases in wages, which is why you get wage stagnation, which we've seen for many years in the UK since 2008. And of course, that also ultimately impacts on not just recruiting talent, but also retaining existing staff and talent, because you can't actually afford to actually keep them within the organisation. What we've seen from the previous graphs and statistics, this level of poor productivity is so significant that it isn't a question that some organisations or some businesses have an issue with productivity, but to some extent and degree, most organisations are suffering from levels of poor productivity. So we'll now sort of try and move to the next slide and give some concrete detail about how poor productivity emerges and in areas that it occurs. So we're looking at here a simplified results of a study on productivity by Weir, and in effect they analysed a number of colleagues and the time it took to complete the same task. What they found by analysing the data was that there was huge variances between those that completed the task in the quickest period and those who took significantly longer. So that variance was up to 250%. So in my little example there where Joe's taking 60 minutes, other colleagues like Jack were taking 150 minutes. So that variance in itself is a classic example of poor productivity. Now, obviously, if you look at the quote from Ray, suggesting actually that where an organisation doesn't optimise, staff end up optimising in the sense that they maximise their amount of pay through the minimum amount of work that they actually have to do. Of course, that's just one reason. There are many, many reasons for poor productivity, such as inadequate or poor training, cumbersome processes, or inadequate tools. In fact, the underlying reasons for poor productivity can be myriad, and not just between different organisations, but actually within the same organisation, but across different staffing groups or different departments, the reasons can be very different. The point here, though, is that the only way to identify poor productivity is through measurement. And the only way to be confident that you've solved the productivity issue is, again, through measurement. So measuring to identify it, measuring to ensure that you've actually solved that issue. So we'll move on to some of the focus areas. So the main focus for the webinar today is to discuss areas around technology, planning and measurement, but it would be remiss if I did not cover off the other focus areas, management skills and processes. So I'm going to give a bit of a summary around those areas before we delve further into detail. So obviously, when we're talking about productivity, there are always external drags on productivity, such as roads, rail, broadband, infrastructure. So these are outside the control of the organisation and management in many cases. But most productivity issues are within the remit of the board and the management team. The issue seems to be, in many cases, there is too much focus on maintaining the status quo rather than constantly striving to improve the efficiency of their area of responsibility. So it's a question of management focus. Improvement should be considered a continuous activity, not a one-off project. So often you go into organisations and they may have a project in place, but has a definitive start time, definitive end time, job is assumed done, and then they move on to other things. The reality is that productivity improvements are continuous, and they need to continue all the time, because even once you've optimized one activity or one process, the business is moved on, the business has changed, and so therefore you need to constantly revisit that particular area, that particular process. And part of that is monitoring what is actually going on within those activities. Another aspect, which actually if there's anyone from the healthcare setting will be aware of, called multidisciplinary team meetings. In effect, these are opportunities from people across different teams, different specialities, who come together to share problems and together find what the solutions are. So, for instance, within HFX, we'll have an MDT, and it might involve development, project support, hosting, all with different skill sets, different specialities, very specifically different perspectives, and bringing the team together to solve a particular problem and gain those insights. Sometimes they will identify the other issues that you were not aware of, or they'll provide solutions that your department alone cannot solve, because sometimes the issues go across teams, across departments. They don't just reside within one department. So that's a classic thing of focus and bringing together collaborative skills across the board. Skills is a very common one that I think many organizations are already aware of, but it'd be remiss not to mention the fact that in many areas poor productivity is because they have not been trained. Investment has not been made to ensure that they're working at optimal levels. This doesn't just affect output, it also affects quality. And of course, poor quality translates into rework. Rework is unproductive time. So skill sets, and not just sort of generic skills and generic training, but very specific training within that particular department, what you might call orientation training, so that they know where everything is, they know where the tools are, etc., to do their job effectively. Processes is key. Processes should help an organization be efficient. They shouldn't get in the way of efficiency and productivity. And where they get in the way of efficiency and productivity, they should be marked for immediate review. Outdated, paper-based and unwieldy process that simply burden staff and reduce their productive time have to be targeted, identified, reworked. If they can't be eliminated, then they should be automated. And part of that is always looking at not just the processes, but the tools. If you don't give staff the right tools to do the job, or the tools are outdated or inefficient, you are providing a drag. So sometimes it's investing in those tools and those skills will improve productivity with the staff. A classic example, obviously, I'm HFX, for instance, we're able to improve the productivity of our development team by 10% simply by rolling out new, faster laptops. So that they could compile and test their code so much quicker. So these things don't have to be complicated. They don't have to be time consuming. Often identifying the issue is the hardest part of the process. Once you've identified the issue, the solution often can be very quick and cost effective. Moving on to technology, the ability for technology not just to automate processes, but to transform them is no longer a vision, but a reality for most high-tech organizations. If you look at Amazon, for instance, and how they've applied technology to every aspect of what they do. The key, though, is that both process transformation and technology automation should be viewed as a single, inseparable goal and activity. If you automate an unwieldy manual process, you will improve productivity, but there are much bigger gains to be made if you combine the both and transform the process with the automation technology as well. If I move on to planning and measurement, again, technology plays a big part in this, because it can not only improve the planning, but it can actually provide real-time measurement and tracking, which will enable organizations to close the loop on productivity initiatives and implement continuous improvement easily and cost effectively. What I mean by this is that you can not only plan more intelligently, but actually you can then capture data that you can compare against the plan to see whether that plan needs improving, to see whether actually we achieved the plan or not. So there's no point putting in a process, there's no point putting in technology or plans or changes unless you can measure the efficacy of those, because otherwise you're working on assumptions. So moving on to some of the key questions that you need to ask yourself within an organization if you're really serious about productivity. So we'll go to the next slide and have a look at these.
Hang on a second, Nick. We actually have a poll to ask our audience here. So obviously, Nick, you've just taken us through these 5 productivity areas that organisations need to focus on. Now we want you to tell us which ones of those you do need to focus on yourselves. So the options again are management, skills, processes, technology, planning, and measurement. Nick, do you have an instinct about which one would come out as the key area that people are concerned about?
I think I'm taking a guess here, but I think often people go for processes rather than the other 5.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everyone for voting. Actually, we've got a really even split across all the options here, obviously because it was multiple choice. I think many of you might have selected the fact that you may need to focus on more than one area. So we have management just squeaking out on top with 50% of you checking that option. Processes and planning and measurement each getting 47% of the vote. 40% of you saying that technology is an area you need to focus on, and coming up last but not least is skills, with a third of you saying that you need to focus on that. So it's really interesting that all of these areas are coming up as things that you're concerned about and that you're needing to work on. Okay, so as Nick mentioned, we're now going to start looking at some of the questions that you might need to answer to help you understand your organisation's productivity better.
So within an organization focused on productivity, you're looking how productive are my staff and what is getting in their way of productivity. Your staff are often, in most organizations, your biggest cost. So to be able to answer where are my staff, what are they working on and for who? Are they actually working in alignment with business demand? In other words, are they actually there when they're needed and not there when they're not needed? And what changes must be made to align the staff roster to the business demand to avoid unnecessary downtime, overtime, unproductive time? So those are key questions, along with what is the overtime, the absence, the unproductive time, not just sort of last year, but this month, this week, today, so that you can actually have real-time information about what's actually going on within the organization. If you can't answer these questions, it's going to be very, very hard for you to tackle and identify areas of unproductivity within your organization. So a lot of productivity improvements start off with we think this or we think that, but they're actually not based on real data captured from what's actually going on within the organization. Some classic examples of that, when we implement, for instance, the time and attendance system, we often find there's a huge disparity between perceived levels of absence, which have been reported through manual reports to the management to work out the absence rate within the organization. As soon as it's being captured in real time, they suddenly realize actually our absence levels are double what we thought they were. So part of answering these questions is actually about being more scientific and more data aware of what's going on within the organization. So we'll put this into another key example, which we found again in many organizations. So if we go to the next slide, I talked about shift patterns and aligning staff to business demand. It mainly affects shift-based workers, but to some extent also affects white-collar organisations as well. So to some extent has an impact across the board. Many organisations roster their staff based on an average or assumed workload rather than actually mapping staff patterns to actual business demand. And this creates huge inefficiencies. So I've simplified this graph for you today. And if you see the thick black bar going across horizontally, typically they'll roster in a flat line across times of the day, days of the week, etc. But actually demand fluctuates. And what you can see here is that on Monday, they actually need 22 people rather than 20. What that results in, of course, is under rostering, which is often filled through overtime or agency staff. If they can't do that, then sometimes that results in delays and loss of contracts. So often is filled by bringing in agency or overtime. We move to Tuesday and Wednesday, when actually the number of staff attending are actually above what's actually required, which results in unproductive dead time. And again, Thursday and Friday, they have not met the needs of the business. And through luck or plan, Saturday you can see they've actually achieved the right number of staff, and then they're back into over rostering on the Monday. Now, what's interesting about that is actually, if you were to roster correctly, you would not need any more additional staff. So it's not a cost issue, it's not an expenditure issue, it's a planning issue. If you manage to plan correctly, you would meet the requirements every single day, but you wouldn't incur any costs in overtime or agency staff, and that improves the productivity of the organization. So in many organizations that we've done this exercise with, the difference can be measured by up to 10% improvement in productivity just by this alignment. And to be clear, productivity ultimately is measured in pounds and pence. In one organization, for instance, we were able to save that organization £140,000 per year with an area of just 79 staff. So this is not simply a process that you would apply or a system that you would apply to if you're an organization that's got 5,000, 10,000 staff. The savings are there, the improvements in productivity can be achieved with much smaller staffing groups than that. If we move on to the next slide and talk about some of the solutions that accelerate improvements in productivity. The first one is about real-time data capture. So who's actually at work, what tasks are they doing, how long did it take those tasks to be achieved? So gaining that level of insight is what I call ground vision. For the first time, you're able to capture and analyze what is actually happening within the organization, which for many organizations is a bit of an eye-opener in itself. Obviously, with time and attendance, the ability to be able to automate time to payroll and eliminate all the manual processes, the errors, is a valuable saving in itself, and I think up to about 5% saving per year by having a time and attendance system. So that's obviously very, very valuable. But it's also by calculating that time in terms of overtime, lateness, absence, etc., you are actually able to cost the amount of time you as an organization or you as a manager are actually spending. So the interesting thing that often gets forgotten is that if in an organization you want to buy a laptop, you might have various manual processes, which again should be eliminated, and approvals to actually go and purchase that laptop. But very often, in terms of where you deploy your staff's time and when you deploy that staff's time is not regarded as a cost. It doesn't go through that process. And so it becomes inefficient because no one is actually looking at it in that detail. But actually, where you deploy your staff, for how long you deploy your staff, is as much a cost to the organization as if you go out and get something, a physical tool or resource. What I mentioned before about ensuring that your staff are rostered to be at work when there actually is business demand is critical in achieving improved productivity. So you're capturing what's going on within the organization. With advanced rostering, you can actually ensure that people turn up when there is work to be done, and you eliminate all unproductive or what's called dead time from the organization. The great thing about the technology and having an integrated system like this is that you can actually have a feedback loop. So you provide a plan, you implement the plan, but then actually you're recording what actually happened against that plan. And this is what I mean by continuous improvement. You have a feedback loop where you can then improve constantly and continuously your planning to ensure that you have the highest levels of productivity within the organization. So it creates, in effect, a virtuous circle of improvement driven by technology, but obviously with the right focus from management to achieve that. So that's three of the solutions. There are other solutions, of course, and technology brings great opportunities as well for productivity. But these three tools really drive the improvement in productivity of your staff, which is very, very key for most organizations.
Just out of interest, we're interested to find out in our final poll, which of the following systems does your organisation use? So are you using any rostering systems, time and attendance systems, perhaps both types of systems together, or neither type of system? So just check the option that applies to you there. And it's interesting that the results are showing that about a third of you each use time and attendance systems, and a third of you roughly are not using either type of system. So perhaps that's something you might want to consider in your quest for continued productivity. And we're just on to the closing stages of the presentation now.
So really want to close off, obviously the statement by Peter Drucker is becomes a bit of a cliche. Unfortunately, the amount that it's used as a cliche but not actually acted upon is still quite considerable. But in effect, you can't manage what you can't measure, and if you cannot measure it, you can't improve it. So I'd go a step further, but saying that you need to have continuous measurement and continuous improvement, and those two things need to go together. The key here is you don't stop improving, you don't stop measuring, because if you're not moving forward, you are lagging behind. And I think one of the key messages from the UK productivity puzzle and the lost decade is that we're lagging behind, we're not constantly trying to improve, and that often is because we're not looking at the underlying issues that affect productivity.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Is that all from you?
That is indeed, yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and telling us all about productivity. We're now just going to move into our Q&A portion of the presentation. We have about 10 minutes or so just to answer some of your questions. So if you do have any questions about the content that you've seen so far, or about time and attendance and rostering systems, just ping them in the box and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. I've got some questions for you, Nick, myself. So just to kick off, are there any quick wins to improving organisational productivity?
Yes, and I think by measuring what's actually going on, very often the quick wins are, I can't tell you what the quick wins are other than by having a very, very quick way of understanding what's going on in the organisation. As I said before, often the solutions are quite simple. It's identifying the problem which organizations struggle with because they don't have the data. So they're always discussing, arguing, debating where the issue might be, but they don't actually have the real-time data to actually confirm any of their suspicions, and therefore they can't act on them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, definitely about the measurement first. And one thing that you discussed was that productivity can vary based on different departments or different teams or different divisions of an organization. How can we approach assessing productivity? Is it best to focus on a single department first, to go quite small and maybe pilot things, or is taking an organization-wide, more holistic view more beneficial in the long run?
I think it depends really on the organisation. If they've got a very good grasp of where the issues are, then you would start the project as an enterprise project. Sometimes you might want to, if they're not clear, they're in this debating mode about where the issues might lie, then implementing a system just for that particular area, capturing information, demonstrating where the problem is, and also where the savings can be, that often can be a very powerful business case to say, right, we're now going to roll that out. So it depends really on the organization. If they've got a very clear objective in mind, then you go for enterprise. If they think they want to, they're not quite sure where the problems may be, then implementing on a particular organization or particular staffing group or department, and then rolling it out from there can also be a very good technique as well.
Okay, and leading on from that, is it HR's job to be driving these kind of productivity initiatives forwards, or is it something that maybe individual departments or line managers should be taking responsibility for identifying, solving on their own if they've got a real challenge on their hands?
My view is that if you are going to focus strongly on productivity, then the culture of the organization should be that every manager in every department, including HR, is focused on continuous improvement and productivity. What I said earlier before was that different skill sets, different roles, different staffing groups and departments have different perspectives, and often together, by having these multidisciplinary meetings, you can much faster get to understand what the issue is, and also providing a solution. So I don't think it should be left to one manager, one department to bear the burden of productivity, because across the board in different areas and different departments, there will be different issues around productivities, and the underlying issues in one department may be very, very different from those in another department. And so by bringing them, by taking it as a very specific view, but also bringing in other departments, because often they also have a view about why productivity is low. And so I think it needs to be done across the board, collaboratively, with everyone taking ownership for it.
Yeah, I think collaboration's a really key point there, because there are so many challenges that a department or a team might face that aren't solely their responsibility or solely within their control. So you mentioned that at HFX, your developers are 10% more productive after getting new laptops. In some companies, that might require, finance to sign off a budget, and it might require IT or procurement to get the equipment and set it up, but it's actually the development team that benefits in the end result. So everybody needs to be pulling in the same direction, really.
Yes, absolutely, and I think it's key in this is that many of these improvements require some level of investment, and if you've got the buy-in from the finance department, that they understand that the actual gains can be incredibly significant compared to the outlay. And I think if there is that approach that we will invest to get a return, then that encourages people to bring up proposals and look at how they can improve it.
Yeah, it all goes back to that thing that I hear HR people talk about so often, which is about making a business case for initiative and measuring the result of it. And it all comes down to being quite scientific, as you said, and making choices and recommendations that are based on hard evidence that are going to work. So coming on from that, if somebody was had thought that a time and attendance system might be one of those solutions that they need to invest in that will have a good payoff for them productivity wise. How long would it typically take to get a system up and running?
So with our system, we've reduced implementation time again for our own productivity initiatives by 80%. So often we can have, if the organization is ready, we can implement within 2 to 3 months. So we have a very, very quick implementation process to get the customer up and live and start returning their investment. And we have had, typically we will say with an organization, they'll get a return on that investment within 12 months. We have worked with organizations that literally have got a return on investment within 2 to 3 weeks.
Extremely impressive. That's fantastic. And what would you expect as sort of an average annual savings a company could expect by using software such as HFX's?
So what we would say, generally speaking, with the time and attendance, we would expect an organisation to achieve 5% saving on their staffing costs every year. Obviously, that we tend to be quite conservative on that. Where you have the rostering system as well, we're looking at between 5 and 10% additional savings per year as well. So there are significant savings, and that depends on how well the organization is in control of their costs and people at that particular time. So we have worked with organizations where, again, they weren't aware about the depth of issues that were hidden activities, hidden cultures, hidden practices, and errors that were systemic within the organization, that meant that the savings were very, very significant, way beyond the 15%.
Great. Well, that sounds like yeah, a really strong business case that can be put together for investing in that kind of technology, which is brilliant. So thank you everybody for attending today. We've run out of time, unfortunately. So thank you for your attention and for joining us. Thank you, Nick from HFX, for sharing your expertise with us. We hope to see you at another Ciphr webinar again soon. If you'd like more information about Ciphr or HFX, just click the option that you'll see when this broadcast ends. Thanks again, and hope you have a productive day. Bye.